それでは、ランサムウェアの特徴とその対応、ジョン・ノーブル氏による講演です。よろしくお願いします。I'd like to introduce Mr. John Noble, former Incident Response Director at NCSC. John, the floor is yours.
Tomomi, thank you, and thank you to Nihon Cyber Defense for allowing me to share the virtual stage with my colleague Nawa-san. I'm very much looking forward to the chance to talk about understanding and response and responding to ransomware attacks. If we could, go to the first slide, please. In terms of the agenda, which I'll be setting out today. The next slide, please, Niraj. We're going to look at three areas: the growth of the ransomware threat, explore why organizations are compromised in these sorts of attacks, and look at responding to cyber incidents. What we're going to try and do a bit now is sort of try and look at some of the trends. And of course, we put here, cybersecurity is like driving using a rear view mirror. We've got a good idea of what happened of the trends a few months ago, but because it takes so long to discover these actors, we are unsighted. But I think there are some things that we know about how the threat is changing. And one of those is the way that ransomware as a threat has grown. The number of attacks, some of the latest figures I've seen, a 72% increase in attacks since the arrival of the pandemic. The number of sectors impacted has grown, and the sophistication of the attacks. And my colleague Nawa-san is going to go into this in more detail, but you're seeing attacks which are seeking to not just to encrypt, but to also to steal data, and they almost behave as much as advanced persistent threat actors. And as a result, the impact can be even greater. One of the reasons for this greater sophistication, is that the crime groups who are doing this are increasingly specialized, and they're collaborating very closely. So there's groups who identify vulnerabilities and enable access, other groups who then develop the ransomware itself and provide a ransomware as a service, and then the actors who execute it. And of course, we're also seeing nation states getting involved. Groups like Lazarus from North Korea are now going back into ransomware because it's so profitable. And they're also looking at opportunities. And here's a slide from a few weeks ago in Newcastle University, one of 115 education establishments hit at the beginning of the academic term. I think the other point that we should take is that we're all more dependent on digital as a result of COVID-19, and so we're even more vulnerable to these sorts of attack, and that's one of the trends that we have to do. So let's explore next, why we are going to be compromised. The first bullet point, please, and that's to do with getting the basic wrong. And if we go to the next slide, what we're going to do is and I've got as a background here the National Cybersecurity Centre in UK's 10 steps to cybersecurity, because it covers a lot of the basic things that we should be doing. And that includes, of course, patching, keeping software up to date because those actors are looking for those vulnerabilities, poor credential management. The most sophisticated the ransomware operators we see attempt to compromise system administrators, get higher level access, and then move laterally across the network. So they must be protected. And of course, we must also ensure that basic configuration errors are addressed, because these are again exploited. And there's another one here which I really wanted to bring out, which is insufficient monitoring. It's very important that we try and detect reconnaissance. The monitoring must be in place, and it must be able to go and pick up on some of the precursors like PowerShell Empire, some of the droppers that we're seeing, Emotet and TrickBot, and these are the ways by which the ransomware is delivered. So it's very important that monitoring takes place, and it uses indicators of compromise which are available from organizations like the NCSC. And if we do that, we will then be able to go and spot the attacks. So if we go next, please, to the next bullet, and that will be bringing out that The complexity of networks is one of the problems that we face and which is exploited. And within those networks, we're seeing here legacy equipment. Legacy equipment is something that is very, very important for the attackers. And supply chain as well. These are attacks, as we saw, of course, with WannaCry and the attacks in elsewhere in the world. You can be attacked through some of the trusted connections, and we saw that obviously with Maersk when they were hit by NotPetya. Mergers and acquisitions, as I flagged up before in talks for Nihon Cyber Defense, are also an area of a reason why organizations are compromised, because you are growing, you are attaching to your network new areas, and those areas you may not understand the amount of risk. Outsourcing is also an area you have to be aware from a ransomware point of view. With outsourcing, you still retain the risk, but you are allowing another organization to hold your data and to host your systems. And it is very important that you are insisting that they have got the same high standards of cybersecurity that you would expect, and that you're able to go and hold them to account. We go to the next bullet point, please. And that's a lot of the reasons why organizations are compromised is because they've made the wrong decisions around cyber risk, the wrong investment decisions, the wrong decisions perhaps about getting rid of legacy equipment which poses a risk, and failed to treat it as untrustworthy as a result. So having the right management, the governance, whether and how cybersecurity teams work with their IT colleagues is fundamentally important. And I want now to go to my last of my bullet points, which is around people. And if we go to the next slide, people are really important as part of our defense against ransomware. Yet we see a number of problems around this. I've already mentioned poor decision making and getting that balance wrong. We often see overconfidence on behalf of IT teams and also, I'm afraid, cybersecurity teams, where they will claim to have seen no evidence. And that's because actually the defences are not strong enough. I mentioned earlier reconnaissance, really important to understand, will we be capable of detecting reconnaissance and being honest. Overly optimistic assumptions about it not happening to us. And then I want to pick up on perhaps one of the phishing emails point. The vast majority of these attacks are delivered through phishing emails. So having a campaign of training, putting in place some of the tools which allow users to recognize those slides which are external to the organization, those emails which are external to the organization are very important. We've got to do everything that we can. But also it is crucially important that we encourage users of our systems to report phishing emails. If we can report, if we can identify that we're under attack, we can then take swift action. So running campaigns to encourage people to report phishing emails is a very, very important part of our defences. So let's go now and we'll move on, and we will go and have a look at how we might respond to a ransomware attack. And Tomomi's asked me to go into this in a bit more detail. So I think we want to start with just trying to identify, well, what's different about a cyber attack and what's particularly difficult about a cyber crisis. Well, firstly, let's state the obvious. It is technical, and that can be a challenge for some of the people that you're going to have to, who are going to make decisions, and you're going to have to explain what has happened. The next point is that the root cause of the disruption can be complex and difficult to understand, define and understand. Yes, of course, if there's an encryption message on your computer telling you've been the subject of a ransomware attack, that may be obvious, but it may not have happened in that way. And even if it has, getting to the bottom of how that happened and exactly where you are compromised can take time. And that brings me to the next point, is that computer forensics is not a quick process. And therefore, there is a challenge for those who are having to explain this externally, who are having to deal with the real world impacts from the fact that we may not be clear about exactly what has happened and how long it's going to take us to restore it. And so that needs some really close collaboration between those involved in doing the work to repair the systems and those, as I say, who are dealing with the consequences, and more about that in a moment. And the final point about what's different is that these attacks can be catastrophic, and they can go well beyond the organization impacted, given the way that supply chains work now around the world. So I think we've got to recognize those differences. And as we now go to the next slide and we look at what that means for the actual attack. The way that we like to go and look at it here in Nihon Cyber Defense is to recognize that there are really two aspects to an attack. The first of which is the primary threat. And this is mainly a direct technical attack, and it's about, so in terms of how we deal with it, it's about the technical response. It's about how we resolve the problems, how we then understand what has happened, and we then fix the system. So that's the primary part, but it's just as important are the secondary elements of the threat, which are the consequences, the business impact, and how we then manage our stakeholders, whether they are customers, whether they are companies that we work with, whether they are regulators. And of course, I'm sure one of the things which will come out later is that one of the reasons the impact of release of data, which could have been stolen, is that there could be a large regulatory fine. So these secondary threats amplify the impact of a crisis, and they need to be managed. If we go to the next slide, what we're going to do now is run through how is an attack handled well? What does good look like during a cyber attack, and in particular during a ransomware attack? So the first point I want to make, it may sound obvious, is that somebody needs to be in charge and clearly to be nominated as the leader. This needs to be the second point is it needs to be a response from the whole of the organization. This is not just an IT problem. It needs IT, security, and business teams to come together. As we seek to understand what has happened and explain this to perhaps the businesses who've been impacted, it's very important that we have all of the key information delivered in an understandable format. And I know for many of the companies who will be representatives will be listening to this talk today, they may well have overseas branches. So you need to have a very clear communications plan. That's on to my next point, a core script, so that everybody who is impacted by the organization understand what's happened, and they're all talking and they're delivering the same message, because it would be very unhelpful if one message was being delivered to a regulator in Tokyo and a different message was being delivered to a regulator in London. So very important, a core script is built up across the organization. And of course, that core script will be developed. The next important point is that control is maintained. And by that, I mean, in terms of a release of information, it is very important that you make clear decisions when, for example, you start to inform your stakeholders, your regulators, the stock market. And these are decisions which need to be taken by senior managers in consultation with their CISOs and with their IT teams. So I can't emphasize enough, if you start to lose control, it will be quickly apparent to those who you're working with, and they will lose confidence with you. And that brings me to my next point, which is around effective communications. You have to manage all of these different people who depend on you and who work on you. And so to do that, you must have a strong communications plan, and you must make sure that you are, again, consistent in what you say. The next point is, again, something which we emphasize a lot in Nihon Cyber Defense, is the need to rehearse your plan. You've got to have one, you've got to rehearse it, and I see a very, very big difference between the organizations who've got a plan, who then get hit, between those ones who haven't, or they haven't actually practiced it. It's a much slicker response. And the next point is around the need for specialist help. as I'm sure will come out with Nawa-san, these can be very complex attacks. And you have to understand your own in-house capabilities and whether you need to bring in specialist help, particularly with some of the more advanced ransomware that we're now seeing. And finally, we need the technologists and the managers to be able to understand each other and to communicate effectively under pressure. And there will be a lot of pressure when you go through one of these attacks. So that's good. Well, let's now look at what bad looks like on the next slide. Well, some of these are going to be pretty obvious. So the first one, there is nobody clearly in charge. The second problem is that the issue is treated just as one for the CISO and the technical teams. And the reality is that this is probably going to impact the whole business. So you need it doesn't mean everybody in the business is involved in it, but you need senior management to represent that or to come together effectively. One of the other mistakes that are made is that there sometimes is an underreaction. A problem is seen and it is not properly investigated. You need to come at this with a real pessimistic mind, to think when you hear from Nawa-san about the complexity and sophistication of these attacks, what else could the attacker have done? Where else could they be on the network? So very important, you're not complacent, the next point, and you must not fail to investigate. We often see that some organizations can be slow to react. Given the speed with which ransomware can move across the system and the actors can move laterally, very important that happens quickly. And also, it doesn't, it can become apparent very quickly if technical teams are out of their depth. And this is, senior managers must be prepared to recognize that. As I said in the other slide, be prepared to call in support. Poor communications, which are not consistent, going out from different regional offices, for example, saying different things, undermine confidence in the organization. People will begin to question whether the senior management really have got a grip if there are different messages out there. And finally, to go to the point which I made earlier, if there isn't a contingency plan, it doesn't exist, or as sometimes happen, it's in a folder but nobody's read it and it's then ignored during the attack. That is going to make it much more difficult to recover from this. So those are some of the things which I think go well and some of the things which can go badly. So I think at that point, if we can move on to the next slide, I think we're going to be in a position, Tomomi, to take any questions that the audience might have.
それではこれから Q&A セッションへ移りたいと思います。まず私の方から質問をさせていただきますが、ランサムウェアへの支払いをするというようなオプションも、対処としてはあるかと思います。特に保険金でカバーされるようなケースもたまにあったりします。こういった場合を踏まえまして、ランサムウェアに対して支払いをするという決断、これはダメな判断なんでしょうか？ John?
So Tomomi, let me answer your question at three different levels. So firstly, at a technical level, there is no guarantee if you pay the ransomware that your systems will be able to come up, and certainly there may not be quickly that option. The second one is a sort of moral level. Do we really want to be paying the groups, rewarding the groups who develop this, who are causing harm by paying them? And the third one is a regulatory level. And I think one of the most interesting developments, which members of the audience really ought to look at, is last week's announcement by the United States that it would be a breach of US sanctions if you were to pay off some of these major crime groups, and they are now listed. So you could find that if you paid off, actually you would be breaching US sanctions with all of the business impact that would be involved. That all said, if you've lost your backup, if you've lost every aspect, lost all of your data, you could be in a very, very bad position where you'd have to think about it. So we should really try not to be in that position.
Thank you, John. And I have one question coming in from the audience. Is there any organization that you can ask for help in UK?
So where I used to work at the National Cyber Security Centre, their role is to help. and they're not a regulator. They're not there to fine you, they're there to help. So you certainly should report to them. They work closely with the National Crime Agency, and as long as you give them permission, they can notify the NCA, and jointly they can work with you on this. So I would certainly really recommend going to the NCSC and seeking their advice. They may well be able to go and talk you through similar attacks and be able to share some of the indicators of compromise. And even if you recover from the attack, I really would commend that you share the information with the NCSC so that they can help other potential victims in the future.
I have an additional question on this. Is NCSC reporting, would they report to regulators about the incident?
No, they would not. It is left to they will remind you that you have an obligation or could have an obligation to need to report, but they will not pass. It will be kept in confidence within the NCSC to protect the company's reputation. But no, it's left down to individual organizations to contact the regulator.
ランサムウェアのインシデントが発生したとして、一度被害に遭ったが、お金を支払わずに復旧した場合、その組織は続けて被害を受けることがあるんでしょうか？それとももう二度と受けないということが場合が多いでしょうか？
I don't think we should see this as a revenge activity. These people are motivated by money. The fact that you've been able to recover, the fact that you had an offline backup and you were not impacted and you didn't pay, I think makes it much less likely that you are going to be a victim. The reality is there are plenty of other potential victims out there who they will go after. So no, I think a strong response will make it less likely you will be the victim of another attack. Maybe can I add one extra comment onto that? Though that
absolutely.
You must, though, ensure that you have learnt the lessons from the attack and that you are confident you've addressed any vulnerabilities. That's vital. Otherwise, there could be a repeat attack. So learn the lessons and fix the problems.
講演の中でフォーマットのスクリプト、報告書が用意すると良いということがありましたが、何か汎用的、一般的なフォーマットやファイルがありましたらご紹介いただきたいですとのことです。
I'm not sure that there is, but I don't think it needs to be too complicated. I think it really needs to have two aspects to it. One is what we know about the threat actors and what we think their intention is, and that's very much for the security side. And the second element is the restoration, what progress is being made in terms of restoring systems. So I think the core script's got that internally, and then the core script externally is what we are prepared, what we know about the attack, and what we therefore want to go and say. All I do want to emphasize is that often we are not certain. They can be, and so we've got to be careful not to say things which we then have to change. So it's best to say a little rather than saying a lot, which we then have to change.
John, thank you very much for the very lively Q&A session. And I have the last question for you. What do you recommend for the audience to act tomorrow?
Well, if they want to sleep at night, I recommend they go and check that they have an offline backup, which is updated regularly. There's very good advice on the NCSC website about how they could do it. So please go and check your offline backup.